Hi everyone, and welcome to this special Open Courtauld Hour, which brings our exhibition Füssli and the Modern Woman, Fashion, Fantasy and Fetishism to an online audience. We're so delighted to have so many of you here. For those who don't already know me, my name is Leila Bumbra and I am the Research Forum Programme Manager here at the Courtauld. And in that role, I hold special responsibility for all things Open Courtauld, a strand that works to connect our research and our collection, something our latest exhibition encapsulates perfectly. And tonight, through the fragmentary information that we have about sex work and sex workers at the time, we will aim to kind of interrogate the uneven balance that can be perceived between artist, viewer, and subject. And if you haven't actually made it along yet to the exhibition or can't make it, it is an exhibition that features 50 Füsseli's striking private drawings of modern women, which explore his fascination with female sexuality and the modern women in the 18th century. Here, the fashionable women of the period appear as powerful figures of dangerous erotic allure, whom the artist regards with a mix of fascination and mistrust. So this hour is bringing together academics, curators and experts, and will question whether these works are as problematic now as they were then, which is really interesting always to bring it back to the modern day. And as this visually compelling body of work provides an insight into anxieties about gender identity and sexuality at the time, we are thinking about that in a modern sense as well, because the history of sex is often a hidden one, and its practitioners are more often than not pushed to the margins of history. So we are really trying to address this imbalance and bring to life a rich exhibition to this digital audience. And we're also hoping to offer a bit more of an insight into the sex workers' lives and challenging assumptions as well. So just a little tiny bit of housekeeping before we kick off. The event will be made up of 3 short talks and then about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please do put these in the chat throughout and I will get to as many as possible later on. As well, I just want to say that this event does have a content note, which you'll all have seen when you registered, as it contains scenes and language of a sexual nature. So that's enough from me. I am delighted to now introduce our first speaker of the evening. So first up, we have David Salkin, who is Professor Emeritus at the Courtauld and the co-curator of Füssli and the Modern Woman, Fashion, Fantasy and Fetishism. So David will be here to introduce the exhibition and share a little bit about how it was conceived, etc. So David, over to you. We'll get the slides up. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. I see my role here maybe slightly different from the way you just described it. I think my job is to kind of set the stage for the exhibition by providing some range of basic information about Füssli and his artistic program, and in particular, I think focusing on the place of gender and sexuality in that program. And I feel that's kind of necessary because Füssli isn't exactly a household name. We've discovered he's not that well known, so I'm not going to assume a great deal of prior knowledge about him. He's born, actually named Johann Heinrich Füssli in Zurich in 1741. And I think the best way to introduce him is the way he introduced himself to a British audience who would have been equally or even more ignorant of his background and interests, with this picture, which he exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1781, a picture which I imagine would have deeply puzzled most viewers. It shows a young man, although worth noting that Füssli in 1781 was 40 years old, in conversation with a much older figure whom would have been well known in Switzerland, but certainly not in England. This is the figure on the right is Johann Jakob Bodmer, who was a leading Zurich intellectual, a professor of history at the college where Füssli had studied to be a minister, a Zwinglian minister, that's a kind of branch of Calvinism, minister from the age of 16 until he was to the age of 21, so between 1757 and 1762. And although Füssli would abandon his ministry and Zurich soon after he was ordained, Bodmer was and remained the key figure in his intellectual development. Bodmer was a social and cultural reformer who was critical of what he saw as excessive French influence on German literature and fashions. He was also a devoted Anglophile who praised Shakespeare as a sublime genius, and who was the first person to translate Milton's Paradise Lost into German. He was also, as consistent with his admiration for both Shakespeare and Milton, a champion of imaginative freedom in art. Füssli, I think it's fair to say, inherited Bodmer's core beliefs, together with a determination to rejuvenate modern art and literature through an injection of the same primal expressive force that they believed had breathed life into the classical tradition at its beginnings in the ancient past. And that explains the third figure in this conversation, the bust of Homer, which sits between the two men. Füssli, his gesture, he points to his head, the kind of this, the seat of intellect and imagination. Bodmer too, with his right index finger, points to Füssli's head, as if to suggest that he is passing his torch from one generation to the next, from the old to the young, and specifically to the heroic, virile man of genius who sits opposite him. Now, masculinity, let me see if I can, how do I move this now forward? Thank you. Masculinity is central to Füssli's artistic project. Basically, virility and freedom, both sexual and personal, were key to his concept of artistic genius, and which found its fullest expression in the 8 years that he spent in Rome from 1770 to 1778. He came to Rome after spending most of the previous decade in London, where he sort of tried to carve out a rather uncertain career as a commercial writer, that is to say, mainly as a literary critic and a translator. But he come from an artistic family, and he had was a kind of obsessive draftsman throughout the first few decades of his life, and he by the end of the 1760s he decided that he would abandon literature to become a painter, and not just any painter, but he said in a letter to a friend back home that he was determined to become the greatest painter of the age. Now, in this period in the 18th century, it was generally agreed that the only way for a modern artist to achieve greatness was by going to Italy to study the masterpieces of classical antiquity and the Renaissance. So that's where Füssli went. Please, go back to the previous slide. Thank you. In Rome, he became the leading figure in a group of artists from Britain and Northern Europe who shared a passionate commitment to breathe new life into modern art, which they saw as having been corrupted and weakened by the progress of commerce, and allied with commerce, the increasing cultural influence of women. And they used drawing. Drawing was their kind of their central kind of medium, in part because they were also studying. There wasn't a lot of patronage, but drawing also was seen as the kind of the elemental art form, the basis of painting and sculpture. And for them, drawing served as a stage for the performance of a kind of virile creative power that they identified with the free outpourings of genius and the aesthetic category of the sublime. Both these drawings that I'm showing you here celebrate that freedom on the level of form and content. Both feature what you might describe as excessively masculine figures who are modeled in this spare, bold, self-consciously primitive visual language of line and light and shade. The work on the left is obviously an erotic scene, which was designed to amuse and possibly to arouse a libertine audience, an audience that was also interested in classical culture, and you can see there's a Greek inscription on this large phallic monument on the left, which links this image to a contemporary scholarly investigations most famously by Richard Payne Knight, but by others as well, of the role of sexuality in antiquity, in particular into ancient phallic cults. But it's not simply an image of the past, because the women's fashionable hairstyles are very much a la mode for the 1770s. So that there's also a kind of indirect allusion to the sexual freedoms for which 18th century Rome was notorious, and that were shared by male artists and grand tourists. The drawing on the right, seen from Macbeth, channels, if you like, this kind of masculinist program into the image of a superheroic male nude who is surrounded by witches and specters. This is, if you like, Shakespeare's Macbeth on steroids, in a composition which positively shouts the Füssli's difference from other artists, the radical originality of his imagination. Now, the terms on which Füssli promoted his reputation as a kind of uber masculine outsider, rebelling against the kind of the prettiness of contemporary modern art, this may have made perfect sense in the context of the Roman art world. But the situation was rather different in London, where Füssli exhibited actually an enormous painted version of this Macbeth scene, unfortunately, the picture now lost, at the Royal Academy in 1777. Although some London critics wrote in favor of the picture, most saw it as completely over the top. So sublime, if you like, that it looked ridiculous. And Füssli's works would polarize critical and public opinion throughout his career. Now, Füssli, when he arrived back in London, can I have the next slide, please? In 1779, as a 38-year-old artist, belatedly now trying to establish his career, he quickly discovered that there was little demand for the kind of painting that he wanted to produce. And here I give you a passage from one of his last lectures to the Royal Academy, although it's much later. I think it sums up what he saw as the problem. And you'll forgive me, I'll read it out to you. Our age, when compared with former ages, has but little occasion for great works, and that is the reason why so few are produced. The ambition, activity, and spirit of public life has shrunk to the minute detail of domestic arrangements. Everything that surrounds us tends to show us in private, is become snug, less, narrow, pretty, insignificant. We are not perhaps the less happy on account of all this, but from such selfish trifling to expect a system of art built on grandeur without a total revolution would only be less presumptuous than insane. And let me just point briefly to the implicitly gendered language here, that grandeur and greatness, these are implicitly masculine, and public life, these are implicitly masculine quantities here, whereas prettiness and significance, trifles, these would have been gendered feminine in this period. And this was, as I say, this next slide, please. This was the problem that Füssli confronted when he came back as a kind of would-be great artist, producer of huge public works. He found that there was really no demand for these kinds of images. So to attract attention, to attract patronage, he had to draw attention to himself by making paintings that could command attention in London's preeminent arena for the display of modern art, that is to say, the Royal Academy summer exhibitions. And he quite quickly figured out a way to stand out from the crowd by producing simple, eye-catching images that could command attention from a distance and that were simply designed to intrigue, or better still, to stir up controversy. And the kind of the prime example of this strategy and its success is this Füssli's most famous picture of the Nightmare. If you like, a visually captivating puzzle without a solution. More specifically, we're dealing here with an erotic puzzle, one that gives pride of place to the sexualized body of a modern woman on whom is perched the figure of an incubus, while the nightmare, if you like, looks through the curtains at the back. Eroticism, mystery, novelty, drama, visual immediacy. These were the key elements of Füssli's brand. If you like, the signature style of an artist who never tired of asserting his difference, his singular identity as a wild, self-taught outsider who refused to conform to social and cultural conventions. Next slide, please. But by the end of the 1780s, when Füssli was approaching the age of 50, his personal and professional circumstances were changing. In 1788, he married Sophia Rollins, an artist model more than 20 years younger than him. And this imposed greater responsibilities on him and also the need for a steadier income. One of the consequences of this new situation was that he had to reevaluate his attitude towards the Royal Academy, which up until this time, although he had exhibited at the Academy, he refused to become an academician on the grounds that of his belief that any institution devoted to the teaching of art was hostile to creative genius. Now, this sounds very kind of mundane, but although Füssli insisted that his views hadn't changed, by marrying a much younger woman, he was aware that she would almost certainly outlive him. And since he had very little money, that he would need to make sure that she was looked after. And so he felt obliged to take advantage of the fact that the Royal Academy paid annual pensions to the widows of its members. So in November of 1788, just 3 months after his marriage, Füssli put his name forward to the Academy, and he was duly elected an associate member. 2 years later, he became a full member when he presented the Academy with his diploma piece, the work I show you on the right, Thor battling the Midgard serpent. In some ways, this is a kind of traditional history painting, the kind of elevated example of pictorial art that the Academy was dedicated to promoting, with the heroic male nude at its center. But in other respects, in the oddness of its subject matter, based on a Norse myth that nobody would have, very few people knew, and the strangeness of the composition, it's very much a Füssli. It's very much a kind of expression of his own singular individuality. So by 1790, Füssli now found himself bound to two institutions that he'd assiduously avoided up until that point in his life: marriage and an academy for the teaching of art. And it's precisely at this point that he revived his serious interest in a subject that he'd explored only occasionally over the previous 30 years. That subject being the eroticized figure of the modern woman, who is the subject of the Courtauld Gallery exhibition. And next slide, final slide for me, please. There we go. From 1790, Füssli's public and private paths diverge increasingly from each other. He becomes professor of painting at the Academy from 1799. He becomes keeper of the Academy from 1804. The following year, he moves into Somerset House, where he and his wife live until his death in 1825 at the grand old age of 84. So in public, he becomes a highly respectable and respected member of the British art establishment. But in private, he uses drawing to pursue his lifelong obsession with modern female sexuality as a powerful force of dangerous allure. And one of the most obvious things that you will see in the show is that a lot of that obsession focuses on women's hairstyles, and not on the hairstyles that were actually known to be worn at the period, but hairstyles that are seen to be a product in part of reality and part of fantasy, and to which may be also in part attributed to the creative input of his wife, Sophia, whose images I show you here. But at this point, I think I will pass on to my co-curator. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I shall introduce myself. I'm Henri Gottardo. I'm Martina Lusa, curator of drawings at the Courtauld, and I'm co-curator of the current Füssli exhibition together with Professor David Solke. And to continue on from what David talked about, I will in fact focus more on the works in the exhibition, and in particular on drawings which are represented in two sections of the show, which relate closely to the theme that we have decided to explore in tonight's conversations. One of these sections has been titled "The Other Side of Venus," and Venus in this case is not the planet Venus, but refers to the mythical figure of the goddess Venus. And with that witty title, we wanted to point to the fact that, as David has suggested, some of these drawings, many of these drawings, in fact, represent women seen from behind. And the drawing at left is one from the Courtauld Gallery's own collection. And it's really this drawing that gave David, suggested the idea of doing this exhibition some years ago, because he used this drawing often in his teaching. And intrigued by the figure, by the really mysterious, eccentric hairstyles, looked around what Füssli bodies of work, looked at all Füssli's drawings, realizing how significant his production was in terms of the female figures, and in particular figures in which hairstyles played a key role. Within this large body of work, so we have counted more or less 150 drawings out of a little bit over 1,200. So around 150 illustrate, are particularly focused on the woman, on the figure of the modern woman. And a few of these, in fact, represent the figure seen from behind. What depicting women seen from behind does is that allows both the artist making these works as well as the onlooker. It allows us to focus on the body rather than on expressions or other details of the works. In this case, we sort of linger, we observe the way the fabric follows the body shape, and of course we can also look at all the accessories that these women wear, the armrests and sometimes also armbands, the bracelets, the fan, and as I said, the details of their hairstyle. Seen from behind, of course, these women acquire an enigmatic appearance, a mysterious appearance, of course, because we can't really see what they're looking at. I mean, the drawing that I'm showing on the right is in fact one of the rare exceptions. Normally these figures are really shown in isolation. And in the catalog, we point out to the fact that Füssli, of course, was not the first artist to do so. And the title of this section, The Other Side of Venus, also refers to the fact that, in fact, the statue that you see here at left, this is a later copy after an original that was by Praxiteles, was really the first sculpture to represent the female nude in such a way, but especially was interesting for us because it was notoriously a sculpture that was particularly appreciated for its backside. And so there are sources that relate to how especially male viewers engaged with this side of the sculpture and its and the details of her body. And again, this was not unique. There is a tradition from antiquities on to the Renaissance, and here just an example of a drawing from the British Museum in which artists engage with the female body shape, again, naked and seen from behind. But we could have really listed and illustrated many more examples, and also from later on, and not only of the woman, of course, but also of the male naked bodies. So in a way, Füssli inserted himself in a tradition, but its take, of course, is quite peculiar in the way that very often their body shapes are quite generous. So unlike the female body represented in antiquities or very often in the Renaissance, where an elegant and specific body shape was represented, Füssli's women tend to be of more generous, rounder proportions. In a second section, or actually it is the last in the exhibition, it's titled Dangerous Liaisons, and refers, if you want, to the writings of the French author Marquis de Sade. We don't know if Füssli, in fact, read the Sade's writings. We can sort of infer this from some of his works, from some of his drawings, and also because these texts were known in the libertine circles to which Füssli himself belonged. And in this section of Dangerous Liaisons, we really focus on the representations of female courtesans, a term that was used then to identify female sex workers who had an upper class clientele. These drawings, like you see on the screen, very often depict these women in what seems to be a theater box. So they are literally there to be seen. Whether these are real theater box or imagined, most likely. This also sort of is an important element because for at the time theater, going to the theater, especially for members of certain upper classes, was considered quite immoral because theaters were often a place of, let's say, debauchery and where it would not be good to be seen and to be and to be represented from there. In the particular case of these two drawings, there is no doubt that they both represent courtesans, and we infer this not only from the type of hairstyles that these women showcase, but in particular for the drawing on the far left, these two women are both shown bare-breasted, and despite this very elegant and almost innocuous movement that the woman on the left is doing, holding very elegantly a cup and its saucer, the fact that she's shown her arm is bare, that the flesh is bare, the fact that she's shown bare-breasted, the type of hairdo, the ribbons, the bracelet and the earrings, all these details point to the fact that these are clearly courtesan. And one small interesting detail on the drawing on the far right is that Füssli represented most likely the same woman seen from different angles in order to depict really, in particular, her hairdo, so that we can see both the front and the back of this eccentric coiffure. The drawing at right is quite so it sort of follows those two that I've just shown you, where women are possibly in a theater box or at a window. But the inscriptions which you see at bottom left and bottom right are very interesting because tell us that he started the drawing in Rome. So he left Rome in 1778 and finished it most likely in Ostende, so in modern day Belgium, in 1779, so a year later. And therefore we can sort of guess that these women may have been real women, which is not always, it's not always so clear to detect, to understand this from other works in the exhibition, whether they are real or imagined. But the way they sort of confront us, or the way the woman at top, at right and standing is sort of really fiercely looking out, they sort of seem to have real features more than imagined ones. And it's it's a sort of, it has been a kind of an interesting exercise for us trying to understand what he could have completed while he was in Ostende that he hadn't done so already when he was in Rome. Is it the addition of the brown wash, or is it sort of adding details of their hairstyles? We'll never know. But it's interesting that he sort of went back to a work that it had started in another city months before, in order to make it a much more finished work. And on the far left, this drawing allows me to introduce an important element of these works, is the richness of these works in terms of color. They are really among the most colorful that Füssli produced, and especially these works that he did later in life from the 90s onwards. Observe, for example, the red pointed shoes the lovely blue wash that he has used here, and the fine details, of course, also of her makeup, the pink rosy cheeks and the lipstick that he has added. Not to mention, of course, the meticulous way with which he has added all those white dots on her detail of her coiffure. And even more color in the case of this drawing at right, which is in the Tate's collection. Here, the use of red, for example, is quite extended, and again, pretty, if not unique, quite rare in Füssli's drawings. We are here much more clearly than anywhere else in a brothel. The title of the debutante is really a modern title, and refers to the fact that the brothel's new recruit, who is seated at right, is new to that world, and is laughed about or looked with concerns by her senior companions. And note, of course, the quite revealing and important detail that she is chained to the wall behind her. And Füssli, as often with these drawings, has sort of painstakingly defined their hairstyles in different ways. So we can see here 3 types of hairdos on the head of these of the women. And I left one of really the stars of the exhibition, a drawing from the Zurich's Kunsthaus collection, where we are here again, in no doubt that we are looking at a figure of a courtesan, not only because she's exposing her breast, but the armbands that he has drawn on her left arm shows a phallic shape. So if you had not understood what sort of situation of setting this is, that detail sort of prompts it immediately. And of course, it's as usual with Füssli, also the position of that shape towards her breast adds an extra layer of meaning to this work. And I should also mention that it has, of course, been suggested that this portrait could represent his own wife, Sophia. And I will end with this drawing, which is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it is really the only work in the exhibition of a depicting real sexual intercourse. 3 women are sort of exercising around a male naked body whose head is totally hidden behind their bodies. And as someone else pointed out to us this week, these figures, and especially the figure right, goes back to or sort of shows how Füssli reminisces here the strong naked bodies that he would have seen in Rome, which Michelangelo depicted on the Sistine ceiling chapel. And this just to say that Michelangelo was really one, or possibly Füssli's great hero from the Renaissance, who was greatly influential on his work. And these quite masculine, potent, dominant women not only dominate the man in the fact that they are literally over and upon him, but also seem to have sort of got hold of him because of their strong and formidable bodies. And again, because this relates to the show, I would like to point to the fact that he again here takes the opportunity to sort of indulge in the definition of very different hairdos for the 3 female figures. The hair obsession comes out quite clearly in these and many other drawings included in the exhibition. And I will now stop and stop also sharing.
Thank you so much. We are now going to move away slightly from the exhibition and start thinking specifically of sex workers at the time that these works were created. I am thrilled to introduce Kate. Kate Lister is the creator of the award-winning online research project Whores of Yore, which seeks to build public engagement and disseminate research on the history of sex and sexuality through social media. She lectures at Leeds Trinity University and is widely published on the sex trade. She has recently published Harlots, Whores and Hackabouts, a history of sex for sale. So is the perfect person to join us this evening. Thank you again. I will hand it over to you to get started, Kate. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. Right, I'm going to try and share the screen. So if everything suddenly goes blank, and just bear with me. Okay. Put the buttons so close to the exit button, don't they? Right. Let's try that one. Okay. Right. Okay. So we're going to talk about sort of a 10 minutes. This is a quickie. So we're going to talk about sex work in the 18th century in general, which is a huge topic because we're trying to talk about how people were having sex in an entire century. And I suppose and then we're going to talk a little bit about how that feeds into Fuseli's work and maybe what he was doing there, but I'm certainly not a Fuseli expert. But I did love this quote that I found by a contemporary of his, that he said that Fuseli's women are all whores. And I thought that was a really interesting, like, what does he mean by that? What does the sex worker mean here? Because I think that that's kind of key to studying the history, not just of sex, but particularly of sex work, is you have to be so careful when you make claims, when you are using the sources, because they're always skewed. They're always skewed. We're looking at artists' representations of these women. We're looking at moralizers' accounts of them. We're looking at pornography. We're looking at what's always missing are the voices of the people themselves, like the first-hand accounts. They're so rare. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a subject of enormous fascination for people in Georgian Britain, and it still is today. People continue to be fascinated by sex just in general, and I think that the sex worker becomes a really visible figure of our fascination for sex. They're at once fascinating but also scary, and they're compelling, but we're also, because of our moral script around sex and the idea of what's good and bad sex, and they also can be terrifying to us. So they become these figures of naughty sexual desire that we're fascinated by and horrified by at the same time. They are just regular people, have been all throughout history, but artists in particular have been fascinated with them and have painted, interpreted, tried to explore particularly women who have sex. And in Georgian Britain in the 18th century, well, around the world, it's no different. But what we get in the 18th century is a sort of softening of attitudes to the people that sell sex. We get this slight move away from it's morally repugnant. The only reason anyone would do it is because they were just sinful and awful and terrible, through to something softer, which is viewing sex workers as a victim of male lust in a terrible society. It's not that that's a particularly liberating stance. Insisting that somebody's a victim that you have to rescue is also very limiting, but there is a notable shift as the 18th century progresses. And what you've got here is probably one of the most famous depictions of 18th century sex work, which is Hogarth's A Harlot's Progress from, I think it was 1730, I think he started it. And we're going to come back to this. But what you've got here is you've got this central figure. This is Moll Hackabout, and she's fresh off the country coach. She's literally a country bumpkin who's fallen off the turnip truck here. And she's fallen straight into the clutches of this horrendous figure here, who is a madam, a bawd, who finds young girls who don't know any better, recruits them and forces them to work in the sex industry. And the whole thing is rife with image and symbolism, but I'll just give you a very quick overview. So the legality of sex work in the 18th century, it was and wasn't illegal, which sort of sums up most of the history of sex work. So there weren't specific laws pertaining to someone selling sex. That doesn't come in until 1822 with the Vagrancy Act, which is the first time the word prostitute enters English in a legal definition. But what there was lots of laws that you could persecute and arrest somebody for. So keeping a disorderly house, just being loud, being a public nuisance, being drunk and disorderly, all of these things were used to prosecute primarily very poor sex workers, because they're the most visible, they're the ones on the streets. And if you earn enough money then as now, well, maybe the law doesn't apply. So what was public opinion around sex work? Very diverse, as it is today. There is no one public opinion. You've got the people that view that it is absolutely awful and horrific and terrible, who form the vice squads, who regularly raid brothels around London, and well, any city really, through to the people that find it incredibly titillating and are obsessed with the sex workers, through to rescuers, moralizers. So there is no one viewpoint here. There are many, there are multiple, just as there are today. But as I said, there is a softening of public opinion as the 18th century progresses. The prevalence, this is like the million-dollar question, how many? And you will see repeated estimates of how many people are selling sex in 18th century Britain, 19th century Britain, especially in London, and they're always completely bonkers. They're always like, there's 80,000 women selling sex in London, or there's, I think it's a little bit later, 19th century, 250,000 women. And what you have to bear in mind is that we don't have accurate numbers for how many people are selling sex in Britain today. We're dealing with a marginalized group of people, a stigmatized group of people who face serious consequences if they disclose that they're sex workers. So we don't have those statistics today. Conservative estimates by a government research that was carried out into sex work in 2016 estimated that there's 80,000 people selling sex in the whole of Britain today. That's probably very conservative, but it does show you that the idea that there was 80,000 women selling sex in London in the 18th century, no, there wasn't. But what that does tell us is people regarded it as a really big problem. The fact that those figures were believed, that people weren't saying, hang on, I don't think there are 80,000 women in London, let alone those 80,000 all selling sex. So it tells us that people really thought this was a huge and significant problem. The scale of it, very, very, very diverse. You are dealing with, it's a very complex experience, always has been, from the people that are selling sex to earn a few pennies, engaged in what we now call survival sex work. So it's just literally to get food, make rent, and they're really in a bad way, through to your courtesans that we were talking about a little bit earlier, sort of catering to the elite men making lots of money. And everything in between. There were male sex workers in there, there were women that were buying sex from men. There's all kinds of different services being offered. So it is a vast scale. But I think people like Füssli, they're dealing with sort of the more higher end women. Motivation, why would people be doing this? Well, the same reason that they do it today, which is to make money. You can make a lot of money in a very short space of time. Sex work, there is no qualification barrier to entering it. You can make a very good wage almost straight away. You don't need training to do it. And women in particular can make a lot of money. And even today, it's one of the few jobs where women out earn men considerably. So people turn to it because they need the money. But there was a lot of concern at times, especially in the 18th century, that it was only the most debauched and wicked people that would be doing this, that it was a moral failing in itself. Costs, again, how long is a piece of string? But we do have records at the time that saying the poorest of the poor would be selling sex for maybe some gin, some food, or a few pence. And your mega famous courtesans could be commanding £50 a night. And that's the super elites. Okay, there is a lot, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. There's a lot of slippage, actually, interestingly. Not only the artists are obsessed with sex work, but sex workers and the artist model are often interchangeable. You will see these amazing works of art in the 18th century, and if there's a nude woman in it, or a nude man, they're almost certainly a sex worker. What we get is this face here, this very beautiful face. This is Emma Hart, or Emma Hamilton, who would famously go on to become Nelson's mistress, and she started life as a courtesan in the brothels around London and working as an artist's model. But so she's painted here by the guy who would become her husband, Romney, very beautiful. And then we get other very elite courtesans here, like this is Kitty Fisher, so you might recognize her from the nursery rhyme. She was painted by Joshua Reynolds, who we know employed sex workers around London to be in his art. Now, really famous elite courtesans like Kitty Fisher, who apparently once ate a £50 banknote in a sandwich just for shits and giggles. So they would sit for Joshua Reynolds because he was elite and they were elite. But when it came, they wouldn't pose nude in his art at all. That would be the much poorer. So This is another Joshua Reynolds painting, and this is his painting of Iphigenia from 1775. And we have no record of this woman's name at all. We don't know who she is. Only in his notes, she's referred to as a tattered courtesan, which that's brutal, isn't it? So you can see the real difference, the class difference. But I'm endlessly fascinated by the fact there are all these women captured in art in the most beautiful poses and paintings, and we don't know who they are. Only Joshua Reynolds might have included a name, a street address, but they were almost certainly sex workers who we just don't know about. So there's a lot of slippage there. Okay, so back to Fuseli. What can we say about him? Looking at these images here that I know that we've already seen, the headdress and the hair and the boobs out, this is all very characteristic of the satirists of the 18th century. And there are records that courtesans would go to the theatre almost naked, semi-nude. And they probably, would they have their breasts out? It's difficult to say. You'd certainly attract business that way, which was what was important. His focus on the elaborate headdresses and the flowing gowns, it was really important. If you were a courtesan, your clothing was really important, your hair was really important, your makeup was really important, because this is your shop, this is your business, and you would attract attention to yourself by dressing provocatively. So this image here is very much in keeping with the images that we have of courtesans at the time. What I'm particularly interested in, and I'm wrapping this up now, is he's often placing things around the necks. I'm not sure why he's doing that. Maybe my other panelists can explain. But the images that we've got here, these women aren't weak, which is a shift from a lot of 18th century depictions of sex workers, where they're portrayed as victims. Going into the 19th century, there emerged a genre called the fallen woman art, which is they're often, they've killed themselves or they've been banished from the house, and they're really, really sad images. And that isn't what you've got here. You've got a really defiant woman. There's a strong jaw, strong nose, the makeup is strong, the hair, she's got her boobs out, couldn't give two stuffs what you think. So this is not a weak woman. I find that fascinating. The debutante that was alluded to earlier, again, the thing around the neck. And I wondered if these women in the background here aren't the kind of the ugly bored figures that like we saw in the Hogarth's Harlot's Progress, the hideous older woman who is selling this poor young innocent into sex work. Again, very, very common. He might be echoing that. And then these two women here, again, with the pearls around the neck, the elaborate hairdos. This is consistent with the kind of hairdos that they had at the time, but he's clearly got a real thing for hair. He's clearly got a real thing for it, because the variation in hairstyles that he has. And what I would say is it's very, very common for sex workers to be depicted at the theatre, to be talked about being at the theatre, because that was not only a good cruising ground for customers, it was a good place to be seen. And a lot of these courtesans they were sort of the celebrities of the day, they were the it girls of the day. And what I thought was particularly interesting, that a slang term for a more upmarket sex worker was a box piece, which means theatre box. So it was so common for them to be seen in theatre boxes of the time and so closely associated with it, that became a slang term. So I think that he's definitely in keeping with that here. I think what's interesting again is these are strong women, these are strong bodies, strong necks with things around them. And again, these aren't weak victims, which is a break with how sex workers tend to be depicted in 18th century art. So that's a very, very rattle-stop talk, but that's me. And I think we've still got time for questions. So I'll thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
And I'll stop sharing the screen.
If everyone else wants to come back on the screen, that'd be amazing. We've got about 7 minutes to do some questions. But Kate, I just wanted to say that that's so interesting that you've picked up on the hairstyles and stuff, because we've been asking questions around whether actually the logs about women working with hairdressers, working to buy the materials, might actually tell us more about the stories of those women than anything else.
There's a very, very famous courtesan called Sophia Bradbury, and she was an actress as well. And there are records left of how much she spent. And she died in poverty because she pissed it up against the wall and had a fabulous time doing it. But it details what she spends on hat, hair, hairdressers, and it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. Hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Amazing. I wonder if the route into finding out who some of these women might be through other things like that. But I wanted to just ask Ketty and David if they wanted to answer your question about why these women are so domineering, etc., in the artworks maybe expand on that. Ketty, I think you spoke about it a little bit.
Yeah, I think David was answering, but you need to unmute yourself, David.
Thank you.
I mean, empowering women doesn't, or presenting women as powerful figures doesn't necessarily dignify them. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, the Füssli's. I mean, you're absolutely right there. I mean, a striking element of this is that they are not passive. They in terms of their gaze, in terms of their physiques, and we didn't show any examples of some of their actions, particularly except the one that Ketty showed, the three women and the recumbent man. I mean, Füssli is fascinated by the power that women possessed, and by the power of female sexuality, but he doesn't celebrate that. Rather, there's a famous line in one of his aphorisms where he talks about how in modern society, what's happened is that women have taken over the place of men, and that he says that, and he says that the age of viragos is also the age of eunuchs. So that for he is, I mean, in a sense, he is his images of empowered women and sex workers are images of a world turned upside down, where the proper order of things has been overturned, and and for him, at least, if we follow what he says in his writings, this is a disaster. I mean, it's a disaster for art. It's a disaster for society, so that he is both, and that's where Kate, you mentioned the connection with satire. Satire is never that far away from Füssli's images of women, and there is this weird kind of mix of both endowing these women with the aura of real power, but at the same time of if you like, damning them for the power that they possess.
Yeah, I don't get the impression that he likes them very much. Like they're physically strong, but there's something quite, I don't know, harsh, scary, repugnant about them at the same time. I think that what you said there about it doesn't mean that he dignifies them. Yeah, I think that, yeah, that's something.
He was clearly both attracted and rejected them, in the sense that the fact that he depicts them in so many of his works in this way, and with the lavish colors. I mean, it takes time to produce this work, so there is a clear attraction. At the same time, for his upbringing and his own personal ideas and character, there was also a condemnation somehow of these women.
Great, thank you all. We have probably time for one or two more questions. Chloe's asking if we could talk a little bit more about fetishization, a word that I cannot say even though I keep trying, and how he depicts it in his artworks. And I think that in every conversation we've had has been very about these fantastical hairstyles.
Well, and also I should simply mention that the title of the exhibition at the Courtauld does include the word of fetishism because of that, because it is clear that there was a particular obsession. I mean, we sort of addressed it or defined it to be directly mainly and especially to the hairstyle, to hair, but not only that, for sure. Yeah, in terms in relation to the drawings in the exhibition.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question, which I'll summarize quite quickly, from Zoe, who's asking about if we could say a bit more essentially around Fuseli's relationships to RA. So I think it's probably important to say where the RA was and how it relates to the Courtauld too.
Okay, Zoe is asking, thank you, Zoe. Zoe is asking about the, RA, the Royal Academy, which was in Somerset House, which is between 1780 and 1836, and where Füssli exhibited his works and where he lived from 1805 until his death in 1825. Zoe's asking about, his relationship to life drawing. Now, we don't have a lot of details. What we do know is that there are a small number of drawings by Füssli, which are done of naked female models, usually posed given the pose of classical sculptures, in which he did in the life classes of the Academy, and whether he, as keeper, was directly involved in hiring them, I really don't know. I mean, we know that his wife, interesting enough, was kind of in charge of all the domestic staff at the Academy, and that and that there were, it's reported that she had a number of very difficult relationships with the staff. But that's but in terms of Füssli's role in terms of acquiring the services of models, my suspicion is that there would have been intermediaries who would have done that, but I don't really know.
Thank you so much, David. And Bella was asking a question quite similar, which is about whether or not we know Füssli had relationships with sex workers, and Ketty has just put that in the chat, that we know at least in Rome he was part of a circle of artists, friends who would have had relationships with sex workers. So again, it's a very hard conversation to have, but worthwhile, because we don't know all the answers. But I think that is all the time we have. So thank you, Kate, Ketty and David, for joining us, and thank you everyone else for tuning in virtually. If you do have a chance to come to London and see the exhibition, definitely do. When does it end again, Ketty and David?
It's 8th of January.
Perfect. And you can see everything else, look at all the assets online too if you can't get to London. But thank you all and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Kate, especially for joining in.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And thank you, Leila.
Thanks everyone. See you later.
Bye.